Hello, my name is Indigo, and when I was 17, the woman I trusted most, my stepmother, pushed me into a river. I had believed she loved me, that she was my family. But 5 years later, the memories still haunt me, and the betrayal still stings. How could someone who raised me, who I called family, turn into the person I feared most? And as I tried to move on, I realized the truth runs deeper than anyone could imagine. The summer sun pressed down on Savannah, turning the streets into molten ribbons and making the scent of the river thick and earthy. I remember sitting on the wooden porch of our family estate, watching the swollen Savannah River slowly crawl past, its brown water glinting under the afternoon sun. Vera, my stepmother, was in the kitchen humming softly, a scent of rosemary and baked bread wafting through the open windows. She had raised me almost from the moment my mother passed, and I trusted her with everything I was, even when the world seemed intent on reminding me how small I truly was. At 17, I thought I knew my family. But there were cracks I hadn't noticed, or hadn't wanted to notice. My father and Vera would exchange glances that lingered too long, whispers that stilled when I entered the room. I felt them like static on my skin, prickling with unease. Still, I brushed it aside. I wanted to believe in her, in us, in what I thought of as family. That afternoon, I wandered down to the riverbank, barefoot, letting the mud squish between my toes. Vera called out from the porch, but I waved without turning. Something had felt off in the air all day, a tension I couldn't name. I paused near the water, staring at the ripples reflecting the afternoon sun, when she appeared behind me so suddenly that my heart jumped. "Indigo, careful!" Vera's voice was soft, almost playful, yet there was a sharpness in her tone that made me recoil. Before I could respond, I felt a push, just a little at first, almost teasing, then harder. I stumbled, trying to catch myself, but the river claimed me. The water hit me cold and shocking, dragging me under with a strength I hadn't anticipated. My lungs burned as I clawed at the muddy water, thrashing in disbelief. I had trusted her. She, who read me bedtime stories and bandaged my scraped knees, had pushed me into the river. The betrayal was like ice in my veins, numbing and blinding me. I surfaced, gasping, spluttering, water washing over me. Panic pressed in from every side, making the world tilt and spin. My hands found the muddy bank, slippery and overgrown with reeds that tugged at my clothes. I crawled out, coughing, shaking, heart hammering so loudly I thought my father might hear. But no one did, and even if they had, could they have believed me? Vera's smile lingered in my mind, warm and mocking at once. I pulled myself to solid ground, feeling the wet fabric of my clothes cling to my skin, my mind racing with questions I dared not voice. When I finally made it back to the house, I tried to appear calm, dragging the soaked fabric behind me as if nothing had happened. Vera was there, drying her hands on a dish towel, eyes glinting with some secret satisfaction. "You must be careful by the river," she said, voice casual, almost congratulatory. I nodded, stomach twisting. Something in her calm was off, like a promise wrapped in threat. My father didn't notice anything wrong, absorbed in his afternoon papers and the hum of the ceiling fan. But I felt it, how precarious my place had become. I could not trust the woman who had raised me, not entirely, not anymore. Days passed, or maybe it was hours. Everything seemed elongated in a haze of fear and disbelief. Vera's behavior didn't change outwardly. She smiled at me, tucked me in at night, made meals as if nothing had happened. But I knew that the river had tested something deeper in our family, something rotten. And when we moved through our daily routines, I watched and calculated, noticing her glances, her subtle manipulations, the way my father flinched at her suggestions. I felt a strange exhilaration in the clarity of it all. Fear had sharpened my mind. I began to plan in small ways, how to avoid being caught, how to keep my secrets close, how to survive in a home that no longer felt like mine. The hollow funeral came quietly, almost as if I were the one meant to be erased. It was a warm afternoon in late July when our friends and distant relatives gathered in the small chapel by the riverside. There were photos, but somehow my presence in them seemed forgotten, as though the cameras deliberately skipped me. My father wandered through the ceremony like a ghost, murmuring polite phrases to those around him, but never quite meeting my eyes. Vera, impeccably dressed, offered condolences that felt rehearsed, mechanical, her words hollow and distant. I could see it in the faces of family friends who avoided my gaze, who whispered among themselves with an awkwardness that cut deeper than any words could. I sat in a polished wooden pew, hands clasped, heart pounding with an anger I had never known. They wanted me gone. To them, I was already a memory to be rewritten, a fragment of the past to be forgotten. But I was still here, stubbornly breathing, watching, remembering every glance, every slight. The hollow words of comfort, the fabricated stories, they only fueled a fire in me, one that whispered quietly in the depths of my mind. I would survive. I would remember. I would claim my story back. When the service ended, I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. I sank onto the edge of my bed, tracing the scratches on the wooden frame that had marked my childhood. I opened a journal, the one hidden beneath my mattress, and began to write. Every detail, every small betrayal, every subtle lie, the push into the river, the cold smile, the hollow condolences, was recorded. My pen scratched across the paper, a quiet declaration of presence, of awareness. I could feel the pieces of my life assembling into something stronger than fear. By the time the afternoon light faded and the humid heat of Savannah softened into a sticky twilight, I knew one thing with certainty. They could try to erase me, to ignore me, to pretend I didn't exist. But I was still here. I was remembering. I was planning. And the world, as small and cruel as it seemed at that moment, was about to find that I was far from powerless. I closed my journal, heart steadying, a flicker of determination warming me from the inside. I thought I had lost everything, but I realized then I was just beginning to fight. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. I sat cross-legged on my bed, journal open, pen poised, but the words were slow to come. My fingers hovered over the page as memories from the river surged back, not as a single event, but in fragments, small, seemingly insignificant moments now revealed as sinister. The evening light from the window cast long, stretching shadows across my floorboards, as if they were creeping closer with each thought I wrote down. I traced the edges of my memories, trying to understand them, to place them in some order, but they resisted me. Vera's voice haunted me. I remembered her laughing with my father in the kitchen, her hand brushing mine as she passed. I had believed she cared for me. And yet, there had been subtle moments of calculation. Her quiet whispers behind doors, the way she would look at my father with something that wasn't quite affection. I realized now that she had been weaving a story of me as someone unworthy, someone easily dismissed. The trust I had placed in her felt like a betrayal wrapped in silk. How could I reconcile the woman who read me bedtime stories with the one who had tried to drown me in the river? My thoughts shifted as I replayed more childhood memories, innocuous at the time, but now sharp with meaning. There were afternoons when my father would nod silently to her, his attention drawn to her suggestions about my schooling, my friendships, even my choices in the simplest things. Her influence had been subtle, but constant. The river incident wasn't random. It was a culmination of years of manipulation. My pulse quickened as anger mixed with disbelief. I scribbled furiously, my pen carving out both my fear and my determination. I would not let this be the end of my story. The following morning, the sun rose over Savannah with a heavy, humid heat that settled over the streets like a thick blanket. I moved through the house cautiously, aware that every glance from Vera carried hidden meaning. At school, I played my part, keeping the smile that hid the storm inside me. Classmates mentioned swimming, the river, vacations I hadn't taken. They thought I was imagining things. My stomach twisted with unease each time someone brought up family gatherings. I noticed the subtle ways Vera's influence extended into my social world. Invitations ignored, gifts withheld, casual rumors whispered to classmates. Each interaction left me more alert, more suspicious. I learned to read the subtext in every sentence, the hidden agenda behind every gesture. By late afternoon, I returned home, careful not to reveal the tension that coiled within me. Vera was in the kitchen, pretending to hum as she prepared tea, her composure almost smug. My father was in his study, papers spread before him, eyes unfocused as he muttered something about taxes. I lingered near the doorway, observing, piecing together the cues that hinted at a deeper deceit. Then it happened. A casual remark from Vera about family finances, something she should not have known, slipped out. Her calm facade cracked for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to catch it. "Why would you say that?" I asked quietly, testing her reaction. My voice held a steadiness I barely felt. Vera tilted her head, a faint, calculating smile tugging at her lips. "I just thought it was common knowledge, Indigo. Don't make a scene." Her words were smooth, but the edge of threat was unmistakable. My stomach nodded, but I did not retreat. I met her gaze, letting her know I was aware of the danger, but not afraid to confront it. For the first time, I realized that fear could coexist with defiance, and that awareness could be a weapon. Later, I slipped into my room, shutting the door with a quiet click. The room felt smaller somehow, but it was mine, the only space where I could gather my thoughts without interruption. I began cataloging every incident, every lie, every manipulation. I wrote down patterns, subtle indicators that would have been invisible to anyone else. My journal became both shield and map, charting the paths I would need to navigate to protect myself. I considered my father's blind trust in Vera, the ease with which he could be swayed, and I knew my approach had to be cautious, precise, strategic. Night deepened, bringing with it the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. I was halfway through a detailed entry about the river incident when a sharp rap at my window froze me mid-sentence. My heart jumped. The sound was deliberate, measured, almost too polite to be casual. I held my breath, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. My instincts screamed to hide, but curiosity and caution held me in place. The shadows outside seemed to press closer, and for a moment, I questioned who it could be. Vera, testing my vigilance? Or someone else, watching, waiting, with motives I could not yet guess. I pressed my back against the door, listening to the night, every creak and whisper magnified. My hands shook slightly, but my mind was sharp, analyzing possibilities, assessing risk. I knew the fight was far from over. Tonight, the shadows were closing in, but I would not let them overwhelm me. I had survived the river, I had survived betrayal, and I would survive this as well. I picked up my pen again, scribbling in the dim light, committing every detail to paper. My memories, my strategies, my warnings. They were mine alone, a testament to the fact that I had not been broken. The night stretched on, long and tense, and I listened for every sound, every whisper outside my window. Shadows might be closing in, but I was awake, aware, and ready. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of my bedroom window, trying to make sense of the shadow that had melted into the darkness just moments ago. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that always makes you feel louder inside your own head. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching, waiting for me to slip. My father's voice, calm and trusting as always, seemed like a distant echo. Could he really not see the pieces falling into place around us? Could he not see Vera's quiet, relentless games? I pulled back from the window, my heart still pounding, and sank onto the edge of my bed. I remembered the river incident, how Vera had smiled at him while I drowned in embarrassment and fear, how he had laughed along, oblivious to the manipulation. It wasn't just that she had turned him against me, it was that she'd made it seem like I was overreacting, like I was imagining the threads of control weaving through my family life. And now, as I sat in the shadowed room, my pen hovered over my notebook. I began to write everything down. The small lies, the half-truths, the subtle threats hidden behind smiles. By the time I finished, the streetlights outside had turned the world a faint amber. Sleep was impossible, so I gathered my courage and decided that tomorrow I would start paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Noticing things, documenting things, preparing. I couldn't confront Vera yet, not directly, but I could arm myself with knowledge, with proof, with clarity. The next morning arrived thick with humidity, The kind that made Savannah's streets sticky and heavy, the kind that always seemed to press you down before you even left the house. I dressed carefully, selecting the one outfit that gave me confidence without drawing attention. Nothing flashy, nothing Vera could immediately criticize or mock. Breakfast was quiet. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. Vera, on the other hand, was all sunshine and false warmth. "Good morning, Indigo. Don't forget we have the community fundraiser this afternoon. I hope you're not too tired after last night." Her words were designed to unsettle me. The fundraiser was always mine to oversee. Last year's fiasco with the wrong donations still lingered in my mind, but Vera framed it as a subtle accusation. I smiled politely, ignored the slight sting in my chest, and mentally added it to my notebook. Another nudge, another manipulation. At school, the undercurrent of suspicion followed me. Whispered comments floated across the hallways, small glances that made my skin crawl. A friend mentioned an upcoming swimming event, and suddenly, memories of the river flashed vividly, Vera laughing at my clumsy attempts, my father absent or amused. I clenched my notebook, gripping it like a lifeline. Each trivial remark, each subtle gesture, each offhand comment was a thread. I began connecting them, mapping the patterns that were invisible to everyone else but me. During lunch, a classmate mentioned that Vera had been asking about our home's financial arrangements. My stomach twisted. Why would she be interested in that? My father had told me countless times not to question her judgment, but my instincts screamed that Vera was setting something up. I remembered every time she'd interfered subtly, a delayed invitation here, a canceled plan there, a gift withheld with a coy smile. I began realizing that she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat, a storm hidden behind sweetness. By mid-afternoon, Vera's first overt move came. She approached our shared project at school, offering help with an almost imperceptible smirk. I watched her carefully, noting how she tried to steer our group's presentation to make me look disorganized. Her calm demeanor faltered only for a fraction of a second when I subtly corrected her, and that was all the opening I needed. Inside, I felt the rush of empowerment. I kept my voice steady, my expression neutral, while making sure she knew I had noticed. After school, I retreated to a quiet park bench under a sprawling oak. I needed to think, to breathe, to plan. Vera's pattern was becoming clear. Dominate publicly, manipulate privately. I began sketching scenarios, documenting every encounter, every slight, every shadowed threat. My plan wasn't confrontation yet, it was strategy. I had to protect myself first, gather allies second, and only then could I reclaim any measure of control. Evening arrived with the sky painted in dusky purples and fading gold. I returned home, taking deliberate steps, each one measured, each one quiet so as not to draw attention. I entered through the side door, hoping to avoid unnecessary confrontation. But Vera was waiting in the living room, the soft lamplight casting her in a warm glow that made her dangerous intentions seem innocuous. "Indigo, how was your day?" she asked, voice syrupy sweet. I froze for a heartbeat, studying her expression. She wasn't asking for information, she was testing my reactions. "I'm managing," I said, carefully neutral. Everything went as planned. Her smile tightened. "Good. I wouldn't want any surprises." There it was, the thinly veiled warning. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of fear and resolve. This was no longer about subtle games. This was about power, control, and survival. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, I found a folded note slipped under my door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, deliberate. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The message was brief, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. The dangers I had been sensing, the manipulation, the threat, it was only getting worse. Vera was far from finished. I pressed the note to my chest, heart racing, mind already mapping my next steps. I knew I couldn't retreat forever, but I also knew that recklessness would be fatal. Tonight, I felt the first real stirrings of fear mixed with determination. I wasn't powerless. I had intelligence. I had observation. I had a strategy. and soon I would turn all of it to my advantage. The shadows of the house pressed in, the night heavy and watchful, and I understood something vital. Vigilance was no longer optional. The game had escalated, and I had just been handed my first real warning. The night stretched on, silent but expectant. I stared at the ceiling, the note still clutched tightly. Tomorrow I would confront her, but only when I had a plan. The shadows might be closing in, but I refused to be caught unprepared. Vera had initiated the first move, and I would be ready for the next. I woke to the faint morning light slipping through the blinds, the crumpled note still clutched in my hand. Its paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than ink and threat. It carried intent. I stared at the scribbled words, reading and rereading, trying to decipher which parts were warnings and which were veiled ultimatums. Each line seemed innocent at first glance, but I could sense the malice behind them, the way it curled around my name like smoke in a closed room. My heart was racing, but beneath that panic, a sharper clarity took hold. I needed a plan. Rushing headlong without strategy would only play into Vera's hands. By the time breakfast was over, the note rested neatly on the counter while I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and letting my mind sift through possibilities. My father hummed a tune, oblivious, flipping the morning paper as though life had not just thrown a shadow across our household. I caught myself scrutinizing his every gesture. Had he noticed Vera's subtle manipulations yet? Or was he too comfortable in his routines, blind to the ripple she'd started? I shook my head. It didn't matter. I was responsible for my own safety, my own clarity. Later that morning, I slipped out to the library, leaving the house quiet behind me. The streets were warm, humid with the scent of blooming magnolias, and the usual hum of savannah in summer made me ache for simplicity that had already been complicated by Vera's schemes. Inside the library, the air smelled of aged pages and polished wood. I buried myself in legal guides, social psychology texts, and news articles about manipulation tactics. It was methodical, almost clinical. My fear fueled by research, my anxiety tempered by knowledge. Each note I scribbled in my journal sharpened my awareness, a kind of mental armor forming around me. I had to anticipate her moves, foresee her patterns. Vera thrived on chaos and intimidation. I needed precision. By late afternoon, I returned home with a head full of strategies and a small sense of satisfaction. The sun slanted low, brushing the porch in honeyed light, and I tried to convince myself I could breathe. But the moment I entered the living room, Vera was there, as if summoned by my thoughts. She lounged with her usual casual elegance, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and the way she tilted her head made it clear she knew exactly how to unsettle me. "Indigo, I heard about the little mess in the cafeteria," she said, voice dripping sweetness. "It must be so hard to keep up with everything." Her gaze lingered, challenging me. The words were light, almost teasing, but the weight behind them hit like a slap. I realized she intended this dinner conversation to be a subtle ambush. I set my shoulders, meeting her with calm eyes. "I think everything's manageable," I said evenly, choosing my words carefully. "I don't see any reason to dwell on small mistakes." My voice carried an authority I was still learning to claim. Vera's smile flickered, just a twitch, but she hid it well, like a cat caught mid-stretch. Dinner carried on, a quiet tension settling over the table. My father spoke about mundane matters, trying to fill the space, while I focused on the patterns, watching Vera's manipulations unfold in real time. Each phrase she threw at me was designed to provoke, to unbalance, to make others laugh at her cunning. But I remained grounded, noting every subtle gesture in my mind, the slight tilt of her fork, the way she paused before choosing her words, the nearly imperceptible smirk when someone else commented on my plans for summer volunteering. Later that day, I confided in my friend May, who lived just a few blocks away. We sat on her porch as cicadas droned in the heavy air, and I explained carefully the series of manipulations Vera had orchestrated. May listened without interruption, her eyes widening at the magnitude I had pieced together. "You're not imagining this, Indigo," she said softly. "She's systematic, but you're smart. You've got foresight." "Don't underestimate what you've got." Her words were a balm, yet they reminded me of the stakes. Allies mattered, but vigilance mattered more. I walked home slowly, aware of every figure along the street, every whisper of movement that could belong to Vera's schemes. The late afternoon faded into a golden evening, and by the time I reached my porch, shadows were stretching long across the yard. That's when I saw it. A flyer tucked beneath the garden gate, with my name scrawled across it in jagged letters. My pulse jumped. I crouched to retrieve it and read the carefully chosen words that suggested my life and reputation were not just hers to toy with, but potentially to destroy. I sank onto the front steps, the flyer trembling slightly in my grip. The sun dipped fully behind the horizon, leaving the neighborhood in dusky half-light. I felt the full weight of Vera's reach. This wasn't about me alone anymore. Her influence had crept into places I hadn't anticipated, and as I stared at the shadows stretching across the yard, I realized my preparations would need to expand, my caution sharpen, my resolve harden. Night settled in, quiet and oppressive, and I placed the flyer beside the note I hadn't yet put away. 2 threats, 2 warnings, and a single conclusion. Vera's plan extended far beyond what I had imagined, and I would have to meet it with every ounce of patience, strategy, and courage I could muster. I held the folder tightly in my lap, the edges pressing into my palms as if the papers themselves carried some urgent warning. The sunlight streamed through the window of my room, hitting the piles of documents and the note I had found the day before. My heart still thudded, the memory of Vera's manipulations crawling along my nerves. For hours, I had studied each page, each subtle hint of influence, tracing connections, following threads that led to uncomfortable truths. She wasn't just meddling in minor family squabbles. She was orchestrating, positioning herself to control everyone around me. My mind raced as I considered my options. If I confronted her outright, it could explode in ways I wasn't fully prepared for. Yet every fiber of my being screamed that I couldn't remain silent. Not anymore. I stood up and paced the length of my room, feeling the weight of anticipation. My eyes landed on the calendar pinned above my desk, a reminder of summer events, birthdays, ordinary days that had become unpredictable and tense. I grabbed my phone and typed a few notes to my friend Sarah, asking if she could meet me later. She had always been level-headed, someone I trusted to provide perspective without judgment. As I slipped my shoes on, I rehearsed the words I might say to Vera, shaping them carefully in my mind. Calm, assertive, unyielding. I repeated them quietly, testing the rhythm, the tone. I won't let you manipulate me. This ends now. Each time I said it, a little more courage settled into my chest. By mid-morning, the air outside was already heavy with humidity. Savannah's streets shimmered under the relentless summer sun, but I barely noticed the heat as I walked to the small cafe where I had arranged to meet Sarah. The bell above the door jingled when I entered, and she looked up from her book, offering a quick smile that eased some of the tension knotted in my shoulders. We sat at a corner table, speaking in whispers at first. I laid out the evidence I had gathered, pointing to letters, overheard conversations, and subtle manipulations I had noticed over months. Sarah listened carefully, nodding at intervals, her brow furrowed in concern. "You've been very patient," she said finally, placing a reassuring hand over mine. "But patience doesn't mean you have to tolerate her anymore. You have the right to draw a line." Her words resonated, echoing the resolve I had already begun to cultivate within myself. I realized then that confrontation didn't mean chaos. It meant clarity. And clarity, I decided, was worth every ounce of anxiety gnawing at me. We spent the next hour crafting a strategy, deciding on neutral ground, timing, and possible responses. Sarah reminded me of the small but essential details, staying composed if Vera tried to provoke me, not letting family members unwittingly become weapons in her game, and ensuring I had someone nearby who understood the stakes. By the time I left the cafe, my determination had hardened. I wasn't walking blindly into danger. I had prepared myself, rehearsed my lines, and recruited support. Later that afternoon, back on the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I spotted Vera's car parked idly at the corner. My stomach clenched, but I kept my pace steady. She saw me and smiled, an expression that had once seemed charming but now looked calculated, knowing. Indigo, she called, her voice smooth and casual, as if we were friends meeting by coincidence. I returned a polite nod, careful not to let my unease show. When the evening approached, the house seemed unnaturally quiet. The smell of dinner simmering in the kitchen mingled with the tension in the air. Vera was already seated at the table, arranging the dishes with deliberate precision. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, folding my hands in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. She looked up, arching an eyebrow, her lips curling in that subtle, challenging smile. "Oh, about what exactly?" "I know what you've been doing," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I know the way you've tried to control conversations, to influence others, even to manipulate our family dynamics. I'm not going to let that continue." For a moment, Vera's eyes flickered, the briefest shadow of irritation passing over her features before she masked it with civility. "Control is such a strong word, Indigo," she said lightly. "I only want what's best for everyone. Surely you understand that." I didn't flinch. "Best for everyone doesn't mean undermining me or forcing me to comply with your schemes. I'm setting my boundaries, Vera. I expect you to respect them." The tension around the table thickened, the subtle glances of other family members betraying a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Vera tilted her head, clearly measuring my response, testing whether fear still dictated my reactions. "Well," she said slowly, "I suppose you think you're in charge now." "I'm in charge of myself," I corrected firmly, "and that's not negotiable." Dinner continued with strained civility. Each attempt Vera made to redirect conversations or cast doubt on my words, I countered with calm, measured responses. I noticed how her manipulations began to falter, the control she usually wielded slipping just enough for me to see the cracks. My confidence grew with each exchange. By the time the last dish was cleared, I felt an unfamiliar sense of triumph, a quiet acknowledgement that standing my ground had shifted the balance, however slightly, in my favor. Afterwards, I retreated to my room for a brief moment, the adrenaline still buzzing through my veins. I reviewed the day, the conversation, and Vera's subtle reactions. I realized something critical. She wasn't finished. Her schemes were far from over, and this confrontation, as empowering as it felt, had only scratched the surface. I had drawn my line, but she had already started planning her next move. The evening air was cooler when I finally stepped onto the porch, the sounds of the neighborhood soft against the backdrop of the setting sun. I could feel the weight of vigilance settling over me, a protective armor I had forged with patience, intelligence, and courage. I knew I would need every bit of it in the days to come. Yet, for the first time in a long while, I also felt a sense of ownership over my life and choices. Vera had tried to control me, but I wasn't the same girl she had once attempted to drown in doubt and fear. This was only the beginning. Vera thought she could control me, but I wasn't the same girl she had once tried to drown. The afternoon sunlight spilled lazily across the living room, catching the dust motes in the air like a silent reminder of all the hours I'd spent plotting, analyzing, and steeling myself. I sat on the edge of my sofa, hands wrapped tightly around a mug of lukewarm tea, staring at the wall as if it might suddenly offer me some divine insight. But it didn't. It only reminded me that Vera wasn't finished. She never was. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest like a live wire, every instinct screaming that her retaliation was coming, soon, and with a force I couldn't yet measure. I let out a long, controlled breath. This was not the time to panic. I had to anticipate her next move. My thoughts flickered back to the stack of papers I had found hidden behind her bookshelf, a careful trail of manipulations, forged notes, and half-truths aimed at anyone who dared get close to me. That was her method. Undermine, isolate, control. I wasn't about to let her continue. I wasn't the same girl she had tried to drown in lies. After a moment, I stood and paced slowly toward my desk. The light outside had begun to soften, the harsh noon glare giving way to an amber warmth, the kind that always reminded me of the park near my house where I used to ride my bike with friends before life became tangled in secrets and betrayals. I grabbed a notebook and began jotting down strategies, precise, careful, almost surgical. Who might Vera target first? Which adult could be swayed by her half-truths? I needed contingencies. Every step had to be deliberate, every word weighed. By late afternoon, I was ready to test my defenses. I started with the people I trusted most, my best friend Claire, my Uncle George, who had a knack for seeing through deception, and Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had always been like a second grandmother. I called Claire first, her voice bright on the other end, but tinged with concern. "Indigo, are you sure about this?" "I have to be," I said, my tone firm despite the flutter of nerves. "She won't stop on her own. I need backup." We arranged a casual meet at the local cafe where the staff knew me by name. The sun was beginning its slow descent when I arrived, Claire already seated with a cup of chamomile tea. I slid into the booth across from her, forcing a calm I didn't fully feel. "She's going to try something," I warned. "I need you to be ready to speak up if things start to spiral." Claire nodded, her expression grave. "You're not in this alone, Indigo. We'll handle it together." That night, the first strike came. I heard about it through whispers that traveled faster than any rumor should. Vera had been speaking to my classmates, hinting that I had been dishonest about a recent school project. I felt the familiar stab of disbelief, but I pushed it aside, replacing it with a cold clarity. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of panic. Instead, I compiled every piece of evidence I could find, drafts, emails, witness statements, and prepared to confront her at her own dinner party, where she was hosting neighbors and family. The following evening, I arrived at Vera's house, the twilight painting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The soft chatter of guests floated through the open French doors. I felt my stomach tighten, but I held my head high, rehearsing exactly what I would say. Vera spotted me immediately, her eyes narrowing in a mix of surprise and calculated amusement. "Indigo," she said, her voice sweet, almost syrupy. "What a pleasant surprise." I forced a smile, stepping inside without hesitation. "Vera," I said evenly, letting my gaze sweep across the assembled guests. "We need to talk about the things you've been saying, about me." The room shifted. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Vera's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "Oh, Indigo," she purred. "I don't know what you mean. I'm sure it's all just misunderstanding." But I was prepared. I laid out the evidence calmly, each piece a thread unraveling the tapestry of lies she had been spinning. I watched as her carefully crafted smile faltered. A neighbor whispered, "I had no idea." And I felt a flicker of satisfaction. My heart was still racing, but the fear that had gripped me in the past weeks was now mingled with something stronger: control. Vera's attempts to sideline me with subtle digs, whispered accusations, and condescending smiles were relentless. She tried to twist the narrative, suggesting I was exaggerating or imagining slights, but I countered each tactic with facts, with calm logic, with the quiet authority of someone who had endured manipulation for too long to be intimidated. At one point, she leaned toward a family friend, murmuring something meant to isolate me. I turned toward them, holding the room's attention. "If you listen carefully," I said, voice steady, "you'll see who's telling the truth." The air shifted, charged with tension, and I realized I wasn't just defending myself. I was reclaiming my space in this world, asserting that deceit would no longer dictate my life. The climax came when Vera's facade finally cracked. In front of everyone, she made a final attempt to belittle me, her tone sharp, cutting. I met her eyes without flinching. "I won't let you manipulate anyone else with lies," I said firmly. The words were simple, but the room absorbed their weight. Vera's usual confidence faltered, and in that moment I felt the power shift. I had taken control. The evening ended with a quiet departure on my part, leaving Vera to stew among her guests. Walking back through the dimly lit streets toward home, I felt the adrenaline ebb, leaving a satisfying exhaustion in its wake. I had won this battle, yes, but I knew the war was far from over. There was a storm gathering on the horizon, and I could already sense the edges of it brushing against the rooftops and streetlights. By the time I slipped into my bedroom, night fully settled over Savannah. I allowed myself a moment of reflection. I had faced her head on, and I had not cowered. My family and friends had seen me stand my ground, but deep inside, A seed of caution had taken root. Vera was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully, and I needed to be ready for whatever she would try next. No more hesitation, no more doubt. I would meet her at every turn, with eyes wide open and heart steady. I set my notes on the desk, the lamp casting long shadows across the pages. Outside, the cicadas hummed their steady song, indifferent to human conflict. And in that hum, I found a strange comfort, a reminder that life went on, and so would I, armed with the knowledge that courage was something you chose every day. I could feel it in my bones the moment I stepped into the warm Savannah morning. The tension in the air was thick, like the humidity itself was conspiring with Vera. The thought of her scheming again gnawed at me relentlessly. Even after the last confrontation, I knew that she wasn't done. Her anger, her bitterness, they weren't fleeting. They were a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. I paced across my room, sliding my fingers over the surface of my desk, feeling the texture of the papers, the edges of the photographs I had carefully gathered. Each one a testament to the lies Vera had spun, each one a piece of the puzzle I was assembling to confront her. I left my house mid-morning, letting the sun burn off the last of the early dew on the streets. I drove slowly past familiar Savannah streets, my mind rehearsing every possible scenario. What if she cornered me in front of my friends at the community center? What if she tried to make it personal in front of my father? The anxiety made my stomach twist, but it also sharpened my focus. I couldn't afford to falter, not now, not when everything I cared about, everything I had worked to protect, was on the line. By the time I reached Vera's house, the late morning sun had turned the streets golden, the shadows of live oaks stretching lazily across the sidewalks. I parked a few houses down, my pulse quickening. I could see her through the curtains, moving with that deliberate precision she always carried, as if plotting the world around her like pieces on a chessboard. My hand rested on the door handle of my car, gripping the leather, grounding myself. Today, I reminded myself I would not be intimidated. I had barely crossed the threshold of the community center that afternoon when I realized how calculated Vera's next move was. She had chosen the town's summer fundraiser as her stage, a public place teeming with neighbors, families, and friends. And, true to form, she began her attack subtly at first, inserting whispered accusations to those around me. I felt the initial sting of shock, a flash of fear that made my chest tighten. Someone had leaned close and whispered something about me that wasn't true, and I caught the glint of satisfaction in Vera's eyes across the room. But I refused to let the fear control me. I straightened my posture and approached my allies, quietly signaling to my friends and a few trusted community members that something was amiss. As whispers of the lies circulated, I calmly presented the evidence I had gathered: receipts, messages, even recorded conversations where Vera had twisted the truth. The murmurs around us grew into stunned silence. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose. I realized in that moment that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting in spite of it. "Indigo," Vera hissed under her breath as I approached her, voice sharp with indignation. "You think you can just turn everything around on me?" "I think the truth has a way of catching up with people, Vera," I replied, my voice steady, each word deliberate. "And I think you'll find that the community isn't so easily fooled." The room felt smaller suddenly, the heat of the afternoon sun mingling with the tension crackling between us. Vera tried again, this time more brazenly, accusing me of deceit and manipulation, attempting to rally others to her side. But the strategy I had rehearsed, the evidence laid out carefully, left her scrambling. People started asking questions, piecing together inconsistencies in her story. Her eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before: panic. I advanced cautiously, mindful of her unpredictable nature. "You can keep trying, Vera," I said, stepping closer. "But there's a line. You crossed it a long time ago. And I won't let you hurt my family or my reputation any further." The showdown reached its peak as she raised her voice, words sharp and cutting, trying to provoke me, to make me falter. But I met each accusation with calm, pointing out each misstep in her lies. Neighbors, friends, even my father, who had arrived unexpectedly, watched in growing astonishment as the truth unfolded. Vera's mask of control cracked in real time. For the first time, she wasn't the one commanding the narrative. She was reacting to it. A strange mix of emotions surged through me: relief, triumph, and an undeniable sadness for the time lost to her manipulation. Yet, even as I stood there, victorious in that public space, a part of me remained vigilant. I had won this battle, but the reverberations of her actions would linger: legal questions, social judgments, emotional scars. I couldn't ignore that. As evening approached, the sun dipping low over the moss-draped oaks, Vera retreated, her fury simmering under the surface. I remained, surrounded by a few allies, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Though the immediate threat had passed, I sensed the aftermath would demand careful attention. The night air carried a quiet, tense promise of challenges yet to come. Walking back to my car, I reflected on the resilience that had brought me here. I had taken control when it mattered, faced fear without letting it dictate my actions, and defended my family with intelligence and integrity. Each step toward home felt lighter, yet my mind raced with possibilities. Vera's retaliation might not have succeeded, but I knew she would be calculating her next move, even now. By the time I reached the comfort of my room, the sky had turned deep indigo, the same color as the dress I had worn at the fundraiser. A subtle, almost poetic reflection of the battle within me. I sank into the chair by my desk, reviewing the day's events, cataloging the reactions, the small victories, the lessons learned. I knew that while this confrontation had been decisive, the war, emotional, social, and moral, was not yet concluded. I had faced Vera directly and emerged with my integrity intact, yet a cautious awareness lingered in every thought. I looked out the window at the quiet streets below, the evening settling over Savannah with an almost soothing calm. I allowed myself a single deep breath, a momentary pause to acknowledge the victory, however tentative, but the faintest shadow of unease reminded me that vigilance must remain. Vera's ambition, her bitterness, her need to control, these were forces that would not vanish overnight. I had defeated her in the battle, but the echoes of what she had done would follow me for years to come. The war had reached its peak, but I knew the final resolution was still ahead. I sat on the edge of my bed, the late morning sun spilling through the blinds, casting stripes across the hardwood floor. My heart still thumped from the events at the community center. The memory of Vera's furious face burned into my mind. I felt drained, my muscles tight from constant tension. But beneath it all, a spark of determination refused to fade. This wasn't just about proving her wrong anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and finally closing the chapter she had tried to rewrite for her own gain. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, reviewing every conversation, every piece of evidence I had gathered. My notebook lay open on the coffee table, scribbled notes spilling over every page, witness accounts, photographs, bank statements, everything that could substantiate the web of lies Vera had spun. I knew confronting her legally would require more than courage. It demanded precision, clarity, and unwavering composure. By mid-afternoon, I felt a mixture of nervousness and readiness, like standing on the edge of a diving board, knowing I had to jump but uncertain what awaited beneath. After a quick lunch of leftover pasta and iced tea, I made a list of the people I needed to talk to: Aunt Martha, who had always been wary of Vera's manipulations; Mr. Jennings, my history teacher, who had witnessed some of the subtle bullying Vera had directed at me; and my closest friends, who could corroborate the psychological and social pressure she exerted. I dialed each number with a steady hand, speaking briefly but clearly, arranging times to meet over the coming days. Each conversation reinforced my resolve. I wasn't alone in this, and evidence could now speak louder than her charm or deceit. By late afternoon, I found myself at Vera's home, my notebook tucked under my arm like a shield. The air felt thick, humid even though the sun was dipping lower. I rang the doorbell, and when she opened, her face twisted into that fake warmth she always wore like armor. "Indigo," she said, voice syrupy. "What brings you here?" I smiled politely, a mask of civility hiding the storm within. "We need to talk," I said. "About everything. Now." Inside, the house smelled faintly of perfume and wax polish. I laid out the evidence one by one, presenting witness statements, photographs, and financial documents. Vera's smile faltered, her voice rising as she tried to interrupt, but I held firm. I know what you've done, Vera, and the people who were affected are coming forward. There's no room left for lies anymore. I watched as her composure cracked, her carefully constructed image of control shattering under the weight of facts. She tried to deflect, to twist the narrative, but every word I spoke was a brick in the wall of truth, separating her manipulations from reality. Later that week, the confrontation moved to a more formal setting, a family meeting arranged by my father, who had been hesitant but ultimately supportive. The room felt heavy with anticipation, my parents sitting stiffly on the couch, Vera perched like a predator on the armchair across from me. I spoke calmly, recounting incidents, quoting witnesses, letting each statement land before moving to the next. Vera's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "You don't understand," she hissed, but the people who mattered, the ones who had observed her patterns for years, nodded along with my account. Justice, for once, didn't require vengeance. It demanded clarity and truth. The emotional weight of the confrontation was immense. Sitting alone later on the porch swing, I let the tension wash over me in waves. I allowed myself to feel the betrayal, the grief, the lingering anger at someone I had once considered family. But I also felt an unexpected lightness, as if lifting the burden of silence had somehow set me free. Forgiveness wasn't necessary, not yet, but understanding my own strength was. I could see the path forward without being chained to resentment. Support came in unexpected forms, too. Aunt Martha brought over lemon bars and sat beside me quietly, sharing stories of her youth and reminding me that resilience often grows in the soil of hardship. My friends visited in the evening, their laughter filling the house, their encouragement like sunlight through storm clouds. Each gesture reaffirmed that I was not alone and that community could provide both comfort and strength. Through their presence, I felt hope knitting itself into my heart, fragile but persistent. By the weekend, Vera's social circle began to retract. Invitations stopped coming, neighbors whispered cautiously, and her attempts to assert influence faltered. The legal ramifications were slower, but inevitable. Her attempts to manipulate documents and testimonies had been noted, and she would be held accountable. Watching her face in the courtroom during preliminary hearings, a mix of defiance and anxiety, I realized that justice doesn't always look like a triumphant smile. Sometimes, it's a quiet settling of wrongs, a gentle but firm closing of doors. As the sun set on another humid Savannah evening, I walked through the local park, the scent of magnolias in the air. The past months replayed in my mind, the fights, the betrayals, the moments of fear, but they no longer held me captive. I had faced Vera, exposed the truth, and reclaimed my voice. The scars of deception remained, of course, reminders of lessons learned and boundaries established. Yet, with each step, I felt a cautious optimism taking root, a vision of a future I could shape with integrity and courage. I knew that healing would take time, and that the world might still test my resolve. But for the first time in years, I felt a measure of control over my life. I had reclaimed my life, but the scars would guide me toward a future stronger than ever before. Though the storm had passed, the gentle winds of healing were only just beginning. I woke that morning to the soft sunlight filtering through the thin curtains of my bedroom, a quiet warmth settling over me that felt almost foreign after so many years of tension and betrayal. The house was still, the kind of stillness that encourages reflection. I lay in bed for a few moments, letting the memories of the past months wash over me, a tide both bitter and strangely comforting. Every confrontation, every courtroom exchange, every heated argument with Vera replayed in my mind like fragments of a long, exhausting play. But unlike before, I felt a strange calm beneath the storm. I had endured, I had acted, and now I could breathe again. By mid-morning, I found myself on the porch, wrapped in a cardigan against the crisp autumn breeze. The leaves outside were turning gold and amber, drifting slowly to the ground. I thought about the phone calls I had avoided, the letters I had never sent, the apologies that had never reached those who deserved them. And then I realized something. Healing wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about acknowledging it, accepting it, and taking careful, deliberate steps forward. With that in mind, I made a silent promise to myself. Today, I would reconnect with the people I had nearly lost, starting with Mom. Mom was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming softly to herself as she arranged a bouquet of freshly cut chrysanthemums on the counter. The simple act felt like a bridge across the distance that had grown between us. "Good morning, sweetie," she said without looking up. Her voice carried the same warmth it had always had, but there was a subtle tension behind it, a shadow of worry that lingered even now. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined her at the table, feeling the years of unspoken grievances settle gently between us like dust that had finally found its place. We spoke cautiously at first, treading around the painful edges of past betrayals. I told her about my experiences, the way Vera had manipulated situations, and how I had fought to protect not only myself, but the integrity of our family. Mom listened with quiet patience, nodding at the right moments, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Indigo," she finally said, reaching across the table to hold my hand. "I've always known you were stronger than you realized, and now you've shown me just how much courage looks like." That simple acknowledgement, free from recrimination or guilt, felt like a balm I hadn't known I needed. Later that afternoon, I met with Sarah, my oldest friend, at the local park where we had spent countless afternoons as kids, laughing and dreaming about the future. Watching the sunlight dance on the pond's surface, I felt a subtle shift in our dynamic. We shared stories, some trivial, some heavy, but all of them grounding us in the present. Sarah laughed softly at one of my self-deprecating jokes, and I realized how much I had missed this uncomplicated connection. "You've changed, Indigo," she said thoughtfully. "Not in a bad way. You're just more yourself than ever." I smiled, feeling that cautious optimism bloom inside me like the first tentative shoots of spring. By early evening, I found myself volunteering at the local youth center, a place I had once avoided because the memories of Vera's interference made me wary of community involvement. But today, standing before a group of younger girls who hung on my every word, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I shared lessons from my journey, not the sensationalized, dramatic versions, but the raw truths about resilience, standing up for oneself, and maintaining moral integrity even when it feels impossible. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that teach us who we really are," I told them. The nods, the attentive gazes, reminded me that my experiences weren't wasted. They could become someone else's lifeline, and in that thought, I found empowerment I hadn't expected to feel. Returning home, the house was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching objects, noticing little details that had gone unnoticed before. The well-worn armchair where Dad had once read to me, the slightly chipped mug Mom always used for her morning tea. Each piece told a story of endurance, love, and the quiet persistence of ordinary life. I sat down with a journal, letting my pen trace the contours of memory and reflection. I forgave myself for the bitterness I had carried, acknowledged the scars Vera had left, and allowed myself to hope without reservation. That night, I finally called Vera. It was not an angry call, nor one filled with recrimination. I simply acknowledged her choices, recognized the consequences she faced, and expressed my intention to move forward without lingering resentment. "I hope you find your way," I said calmly, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. She didn't respond, but I didn't need her to. The act itself, closing that chapter on my terms, was enough. As I prepared for bed, I glanced out the window at the softly glowing streetlights, each one a tiny beacon of the quiet life resuming its rhythm around me. I felt the steady beat of my own heart, a reminder that I was alive, capable, and unbroken. The autumn breeze whispered through the open window, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, a subtle promise that life, like the seasons, moves forward in its own quiet, inevitable way. I knew the road ahead would not be without challenges, but I felt ready to face them. Though the scars remain, I am stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the life I was always meant to live. Before we wrap up this story, I want to leave you with this thought. Sometimes the people we trust the most can let us down, but our strength comes from how we rise after the fall. What would you do if someone you loved betrayed you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next story, where we uncover even more real-life twists and lessons.